Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I'll do my usual and wait a little while until I get started. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. This is the 78th in the series, and we're looking at some further tales from our Asylum records. For those who don't know, my name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands, and together they tell the story of the Highlands through documentary records. We have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, which is predominantly where the collections that I'm going to talk about today are situated. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochal Archive Centre in Portree. It's nice to see everybody saying hello. It's always a relief to know that it's going out fine and people are saying hello. Before I go any further, this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. The other thing I'm going to say before I start launching into this subject is that I had a comment last week from someone who said that they weren't able to hear me very clearly, so I've moved my microphone much nearer to me, so hopefully that'll make a bit of a difference. But just to let you know, the message did get through. So throughout September we have been looking at life stories. We've covered the life of Jane Durham, a conservationist, and the extraordinary life of Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, and I absolutely loved looking through your comments about that and some opinions on his life. I wanted to use this week's slot to talk about the lives of some people who appear in our asylum and other mental health records. I want to look at the system that has shaped so many lives. I thought this week, rather than look at one person, I would look at the fact that a system has existed over hundreds of years which has shaped the lives of many hundreds of people in the Highlands. And the first thing I'm going to say, I've spoken a couple of times about this subject before. If you've seen them, let me know. If you haven't seen them yet, they're all available on YouTube. One of the main things I always want to get across when I talk about this subject is this is not about capitalising on people's difficult circumstances. This is absolutely about having respect for those lives, acknowledging the fact that there are difficult times in people's lives, and that we are privileged to look after the records that contain those people's stories. So as I said, I've previously spoken about this subject, and what I've usually done has focused on the records of the Inverness District Lunatic Asylum. And you will hear me using the word lunatic several times as it does appear throughout the records. Later, that institution became known as Craigdenane, which opened in 1864. But this week what I thought I would do was finish with some extracts from that collection, but I wanted to use this opportunity to look at the longer story of mental health treatment and care in the Highlands. So in 1815 there was an act passed that was entitled the Act to Regulate Madhouses in Scotland. This was the start of Scottish legislation about people who were deemed insane. It made provision for fee-paying patients to be confined into institutions that were run by individuals for profit. So not a universal system, not a healthcare system. It is individual people running a system for profit. This 1815 law included the need for twice yearly inspections of these institutions, and it noted within the body of the text that there were also people deemed insane being held in hospitals, poorhouses, and other types of asylum. Now, we know, of course, that there were asylums. Obviously, Bedlam, the Bethlehem Hospital is probably the most famous one, and we know that there were asylums and other places holding people who were considered to be insane before that 1815 Act, but this was the start of specific legislation in Scotland, as opposed to a kind of reactionary system, a reactionary approach on a case-by-case basis. The next piece of legislation that has a bearing on this subject was the 1845 Poor Law Scotland Act, and I'll come back to that shortly. But what did mental health care look like and the treatment look like prior to 1845? There's a really clear divide as you look across the spectrum of this story, and the shift between it being a custodial, sort of sheriff-led system, a court system, transferring and developing into a healthcare system. And I'll touch on that as we go through. So up until 1845, the system was custodial. It was sheriff-led, not medically led, and it was fairly badly administered. And as I say, it tended to be a bit more on an ad hoc basis of, we've got this situation, what are we going to do with this person? So for this period, and we'll see this as we go right through this session, that where we look for the records entirely depends on what time period we're talking about. There is no one collection that tells this story. So prior to 1845, we would look for records of the insane within court process papers, within Tolbooth warding books, so that's the jail warding books, prison board minutes, and hospital records. So you can see there very much that leaning towards the custodial, towards the court system. Within our sheriff court process papers that we hold at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness is a warrant for from 1796 to transmit Angus Smith, who was a farm labourer from Arasaig, to Inverness jail as he was considered to be dangerously insane. And that court document, that warrant, describes Angus's behaviour like this. It says that he did, since the month of September last, show strong symptoms of insanity, and these by several fits increased to such a degree of violence as threatened immense damage to his own wife and children, his neighbours and society at large, by making unprovoked attacks on several individuals and attempts to destroy himself. So you can see there that it's the fact that he is dangerous to himself and to other people that's been the deciding factor that has prompted a need for him to be put into some kind of restrained care. So what did this warrant authorise should happen to him? The warrant says, or the people serving the warrant say, they grant warrant to mayors and officers of court with the assistance of a party of the troops of Fort William to convey the person of the said Angus Smith, prisoner, from Fort William to the county jail at Inverness, or other madhouse there, fit for a person in his unhappy state. So the warrant is giving authorisation for Angus to be transported from Fort William to the Inverness jail in the company of troops from Fort William. So again, you see the fact there that there's a person who is suffering. It describes his unhappy state. There's no specific place to take him, and so instead they're going to put him into a jail because their reasoning is at least then he'll be safe, and the people who might be affected would also be safe. So we've seen that warrant. We can then go to the Borough of Inverness collections, to the Tolbooth warding book, the prison warding book, and see if Angus was indeed taken to the Tolbooth. And we have an extract dated 22nd of December 1796, which reads like this. That day, Angus Smith, workman or labourer in the farm of Drummondarach of Arasaig, was incarcerated within the Tolbooth of Inverness in consequence of a petition at the insistence of the Procurator Fiscal for the Fort William district, and warrant thereon by Colin Campbell, Sheriff Substitute, which was refused by the magistrates. The said Angus Smith being insane in mind but out of humanity, and at the request of the Sheriff Depute, they agreed to detain him for a space not exceeding 1 month. So it's interesting to note that we've got the document that authorises him being taken, and we've got the document that confirms that he was indeed admitted. The other thing I like about that extract, as sad as it is that it has a reference there to the humanity that they're trying to use. They're trying to, they accept that they'll take him into the jail, but they say because of humanity, they're going to try and detain him for a space not more than 1 month. So there, you get a sense of the fact that they don't want to put him into jail, but they don't know what else to do with him. They're well aware that this is not an ideal situation. And so you see my point there about the system being custodial, being sheriff-led. but an awareness that he's dangerous and they need to somehow control him, but they don't know how. Another court document from the collection, it goes on to explain why Angus was thought to be dangerous. It says that he also struck Donald McKeechan, labourer in Borrowdale, his father-in-law, several times and threatened to kill him, and did actually attempt to destroy the said Donald McKeechan and Neil McKeechan, labourers at Drummondarach, with a carpenter's adze, and it's believed that he would have killed them were it not that he was laid hold of and deprived of the weapon. The final reference that we have relating to Angus Smith and to his story is one line in the Tolbooth Warding Book of 17th of February 1797, and it just reads, "That day the said Angus Smith died in jail." Just one sentence, just a few words that give an insight into a person's life. But as I've said previously, that life not any less worthy of remembrance than the grand and great lives that we often talk about. Another example from pre-1845 is the example of Robert Brebner. This story can be found in the Ross and Cromarty Prison Board Minute Books of 1843. On the 13th of October, the board recorded receipt of a letter from the General Board of Directors of Prisons in Edinburgh and the Governor of Dingwall Prison. It's noted that Robert Brebner had been committed to the prison several months earlier for lunacy, on the understanding that he would need to be transferred to the Inverness Infirmary as soon as there was room. So again, there is an awareness there of the conflict between court and health responsibility, and the fact that they've put him into, much like that Angus Smith case, they've put him into the prison in Dingwall, but only until they can find space for him in Inverness Infirmary. So, and as I say, an awareness that the situation wasn't ideal, but they didn't know what else to do. And of course, at this point, we're still over 100 years away from having a National Health Service with a kind of broad overview of this sort of thing. So the letter sent to the prison board noted the urgency of moving Brebner from the prison to a hospital. This extract, I'll read you two extracts that are both included in that letter to the prison board, written by the governor and the surgeon. The first one is from Dingwall Prison, 12th of October 1843, and it says, "Sir, I beg leave to submit to your notice that the lunatic Robert Brebner, in Dingwall Prison since the 30th of August last, 44 days, is losing the use of his legs through the extreme cold and damp of the only place that I have to confine him in. The damp is occasioned by the rain coming down through the old steeple into his cell at nearly all points. I am yours, etc., James Stewart, prison keeper." So the prison keeper is saying, look, we're keeping this person in a situation, he's done nothing wrong necessarily, he's not well, and now there's a physical impact on him. That's also backed up by a letter included by the prison surgeon, Donald Ross, which says, written to the board, which says, "Dear Sir, there is a poor unfortunate deranged man at present confined in the Dingwall jail, who is for the last 3 or 4 days unwell, arising from the cold I have no doubt that he gets. It is in the Green Garret that he's confined, unless a more suitable than his present place of confinement is found for him, and that immediately, the consequence may to him be serious." So again, just a reinforcing of the fact that the situation is not good enough. Also that very evocative, I think, the name of his being kept in the Green Garret. However, there was no space in the infirmary, which is what they were trying to do, put him into the hospital. There was no space. But the minutes also record an alternative solution appeared in the form of Duncan Mackintosh of 42 King Street, Inverness. He was the brother of the infirmary keeper, and he offered to take Robert Brebner into his own house until space could be found for him in the hospital. So again, a huge example of compassion there within the system, but the fact that the system is at fault that it needs that. The next related piece of legislation, as I've mentioned, came in 1845, the Poor Law Scotland Act. The law established parochial boards with responsibility for those who are unable to care for themselves, so the poor, the sick, orphans, and the insane. And I've talked about this before in terms of poor relief records, specifically to do with poverty. and I'll come on in October to look at this in the poor law records as well. But it also included a remit to look after people who were considered insane. The law gave the parochial boards the authority to place dangerously insane people into an asylum, and it established asylum wards in some poorhouses. So this is the start of specific asylum wards within a poorhouse. This led to care becoming more to do with welfare and health and less about punishment and court. There starts to be some improved accountability because the system is in existence. There's an operational system around the poor relief. Also the start of real medical supervision. And we can use the parochial board poor relief minutes and records to find out more about this period. So again, we're now moving away from the court records that we've started with and moving into poor relief records alongside things like census and others. So for instance, the parochial board records for Farr in Sutherland, which are extensive, show Mary Mackay or Mary Ogg, who lived in Kirtorney in the parish of Farr. She was admitted onto the roll of poor in November 1846. Her age doesn't seem to have been known at the time that she was admitted, but it's noted later that she was around 27 in 1865, and that would have made her very young at her time of admission, if that's correct. She's recorded in the poor relief records as being weak of mind and partially destitute, living with her family, who are noted as having a lot of land, as in an area of land, and cattle. And Mary was supported by the parish. She had been born there, so she was entitled to that support until her death in 1875. And as I say, you can see there that we've gone from prison and court records to a start of a welfare system set of records. Better, but still not right. It was the 1857 Lunacy Scotland Act and subsequent acts and amendments which really changed the system. The 1857 Act and its 1862 and 1866 amendments established a general board of commissioners in lunacy, and they had oversight of all asylums, and it was under this act that Inverness District Asylum came into being in 1864. It was also at this time that medical commissioners were appointed to oversee the care of and treatment of people who were deemed insane. And from 1857 onwards, care was supervised, it was accountable, it was administered by a central board with that specific remit. So it's not part of another system now, it's not part of the poor relief system or the prison system, it's now a specific central board for lunacy. There were a number of asylums that existed prior to the opening of Inverness District Asylum in 1864. There were royal mental hospitals across Scotland. There was one in Aberdeen, in Dundee, in Glasgow, in Montrose and other places, but none in the Highlands. And often they were split class-wise. There were private asylums as well, and we hold references within various records to people being held in private asylums, for instance in Musselburgh, where there was more than one. From a Highland point of view, we had Mr Hislop's asylum at Englishton at Bunshrew, which is just outside Inverness, and that opened in 1859. The OS name book, which I've spoken about before, the Ordnance Survey name book that accompanied the first edition Ordnance Survey map, which was published just after Englishton Asylum closed, describes it as a two-storey house, slated and in good repair. There are several cottages and outbuildings situated a short distance from the house, which are 1 storey high and thatched. The whole being originally built for a farmhouse and offices, but was for 7 years used as a private lunatic asylum. It's now closed. So, different type of record again that gives us a physical description of the buildings that were used as a private asylum. That extract was published alongside the first edition map in 1864, at which point Englishton was closed because Inverness District Asylum, that would go on to become Craigdenane, had been opened. Craigdenane, as I've mentioned before, was the 3rd district lunatic asylum to be opened in Scotland, and it had a uniquely large catchment area and particularly interestingly a bilingual population. As I've mentioned previously, it was renamed Craigdenane Hospital in 1947, around the time of the creation of the NHS, and just continuing that move from towards central welfare and medical expertise. Now, I've spoken before about the amazing Inverness Asylum collection. It is extensive, it's fascinating, and it contains the stories of many, many hundreds of people. I've also said before, but I will reiterate it, that those records are closed for 100 years. So currently we have access up until 1921. The collection is extensive, as I say, so there are admission registers, case notes, and I'm going to finish today's session once again by looking at these asylum records. One thing I would say, and again I'm aware I say this every time I talk about this subject of mental health, is that these volumes confirm what we know to be true, that a mental health problem can happen to anyone in any walk of life, at any age, at any time. And I think they are very, very good for sharing that, reaffirming that information to people. And certainly when I've worked with mental health groups in the past, that's something I think that is a very useful thing to see, that although these records are 200 years old, 150 years old, many of the situations are similar. There are people there, all different backgrounds. There are teenagers, there are elderly people, there are middle-aged men and women entering the asylum. There are people from a wide range of jobs. So for instance, and I've just jotted down some of them to share with you, there are fishermen, seamstresses, firemen, labourers, governesses, doctors, butlers, actors, soldiers, jewellers, teachers, nannies, domestic servants, a really wide range of people. And the causes of insanity are just as varied. People are admitted in these records as a result of intoxicating liquors, thunderstorms, being forcibly removed from their land, effects of childbirth, death of a partner, fright from seeing children in danger, quarrels, jealousy. There's someone in for because of the severity of their father. People admitted to the asylum because of the effects of grief, because of the effects of puberty, because of arguments over politics. And so some of those are completely understandable. Some of those are things we see all the time in ourselves, in other people, things that would affect us. And others are things which illustrate the analogy, which I know I've shared before, but I find it very useful, that if you're already operating at near capacity, it can take very little to push someone over the edge. And I know I've shared that image before of a bucket full of water. If the bucket is already full right up to the top, it only takes a few drops to spill it over. And so that's, I think, indicative of this in this collection, that you can see things that have just been the last straw for people. I've run through the system before, but I'll run through it quickly again. Every patient who was thought to be in need of confinement had to have a warrant, which included 2 signed medical certificates. Interesting that the warrant still holds that connection to the law. If you remember Angus Smith, the first document we looked at was a warrant for confinement. He or she would then be added to the admission register, and the details on the admission register included name, age, cause of insanity, date of entry, and what the outcome was of that person's time in the system. There were case notes that were kept for each patient to show their in-house work, their treatment, their social activities, and also a physical description, which is an amazing thing to be able to have for people in 1864. And I'm going to finish off today by looking at one story from within these records. Now, for many people, the way they get into this collection, unless they have a particular interest, of course we work with medical students, we work with mental health groups, people who have a specific interest in the subject. But for most people, the way they'll come into these sorts of records is because of a connection to family history or via a statutory entry. So for instance, they've found a reference on a birth, marriage or death certificate that mentions lunacy, lunatic, asylum, something like that. And that's often the way that people kind of have their eyes open to these collections and what's in them. So let's start there, looking at the life of a man called Donald McCrae, who died on the 17th of February 1915 at the age of 78. His death certificate, along with the usual information such as his parents' names and so on, tells us that Donald McCrae died at Inverness District Asylum of senile decay with brain disease. We can use the information we get from this death certificate to then go to the Inverness District Asylum Register of Deaths for 1864 to 1919. A search within that volume for the 17th of February 1915, the date on the death certificate, reveals the entry that the asylum made in their records of Donald's death. It records the additional information that he had been admitted to Inverness District Asylum on the 12th of July 1864 when it opened, meaning that he had been in the asylum for 51 years at the time of his death. As the Register of Deaths gives his date of admission, we can then use that information to go to the admission register. So the death certificate's taken us to the death register takes us to the admission register. So when we search in the admission register, it confirms all the previous details that we've had, and it also tells us that Donald had been a militiaman who had previously lived at Englishton House, where he was transferred from Englishton when Inverness District Asylum opened. So it gives us that additional piece of information that he had been in a private asylum prior to Inverness District Asylum opening. We can also use the admission date to look for his warrant, which tells us that he was 27 at the time of his admission, that he had been a private in the Stirlingshire militia, and that he'd been considered insane since 1858 at the age of 20. The additional piece of information we get from this is that he had been in Englishton for 4 years prior to his transfer. It also noted in there that he had 2 sisters, but their names and addresses were not known, which feels sad as well. So moving on to his case notes, we get that physical description. Donald is described as rather tall, erect, pale, with a very boyish expression. His head is well formed, but the brow is overhanging. Hair light brown, eyes light blue, teeth regular. And as I say, that's an amazing thing to be able to have. Now, as well as a physical description, the case notes always will give some detail of a kind of mental description of a summary of what the symptoms are, what's happening, some of his behaviours. And for Donald, it records the fact that he would often be found standing in the military posture of stand at ease, which is really interesting. It makes you wonder what had happened, or maybe it's just a habit, but he would often be found standing in military postures. And it also records that it was impossible to engage him in any conversation, and if people tried persistently to engage him in conversation, then they were in danger of being threatened. He just didn't want to engage with anybody. And this seems to continue for several years as the case notes go on right through his period in the asylum. There are just sort of regular, semi-regular updates where someone will just note down what the situation currently is. So for instance, it includes these updates. This man is more fantastic in his movements now, and he throws his arms and legs about in a manner as if they didn't form part and parcel of himself. He still goes out to work and is principally employed in pushing the wagons of the portable railway in the cutting at the back of the house. No treatment. The next one says, this patient has become more violent and untidy and continues to be employed at the wagons. He has required no treatment and is in fair health. And then again, a few days ago it became necessary to prohibit this patient from being employed outside, as of late he has exhibited a greater tendency to assault his neighbours without the slightest provocation. And on the 3rd of this month he assaulted rather seriously Finlay Mackay, striking him in the head with a stone and kicking him. His bodily health is good and he has required no medical treatment for the past 6 months. And it's also interesting to note that that incident with Finlay Mackay is also confirmed by the Register of Accidents. In 1884, Donald Mackay was released on probation. The Inverness Parochial Board had suggested that maybe he could be released for a short time to see how he could get on in the community. But unfortunately, the person into whose care he was placed simply couldn't cope with him, and he was readmitted to the asylum only a few days later. But you can see in there some references to the way they're trying to support him. He's not getting medical treatment. He's not getting those things that we associate with an asylum, maybe. So there's no references to straitjackets, to any medication that's kind of suppressing him. Instead, they're trying to encourage him to work. They're trying to encourage him to speak. And I find that really uplifting, these records, when you look at those things about what they're trying to do. So I mentioned that it was the Inverness Parochial Board who had tried to get him released on probation, and that reference to the Parochial Board encouraged us to check that collection too, for references to Donald at the key stages of his life. And as expected, we find information in there as well, in the General Register of the Poor and in the Minute Books, which detail his transfer from Englishton to Inverness District Lunatic Asylum, but also his earlier transfer from a hospital in Glasgow to Inverness, and his aunt's story that Donald had been in a situation in London before being sent back to Glasgow in a deranged and dangerous state, and his family and friends were unable to support him. So you can start to see there the way that all of these different records give you a little bit extra information. Up until that Poor Leaf record, we would have no idea that he'd been in London, but that then is mentioned within that volume. And you can also see from that, I hope that all the places that we can go to look for information, all the different records that we can go to about mental health, absolutely depend on the time period that we're looking at and the place that we're looking at and what resources were available at the time. And one of the things I always think comes across really strongly whenever I look at the subject of mental health is a real feeling that people are doing their best, given the medical knowledge they have, given the resources available to them. There's you see that in the prison records, you see it in the court records, you see that in the asylum records, that they're just trying to look after that person and the people around them in the best way they know how, given what's known about mental health care at that time. I'm going to stop talking, but I really hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the systems and the institutions that have influenced the lives of so many hundreds of people in the Highlands over the centuries. As I always say, it's a privilege to share their stories, it's a privilege to remember their lives, and it is a privilege to me to know that we learn from these stories. I think we learn as individuals how to have a little bit more compassion. Certainly when I work with school pupils with these records, you can see it having an impact on them. And as I say, without these past experiences, that's how our healthcare system develops. That's how we get where we are. So I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit about that. I hope you can join me next week. We're coming to World War II next week, the story of James Mowat, a World War II escape story. So I hope you can join me for that. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work and help us to continue to preserve these stories and these people's lives, then please do that. We would really, really appreciate that. If you're one of the people who has commented that it's been jittery watching, then I will be uploading this to YouTube shortly, so you can always go back and watch it there. But in the meantime, I'll speak to you next week.